Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series of videos about the great ideas in psychology. This is part 2 in the series. I leave the link to the playlist. In the previous part, I introduced the series, covered the first chapter of the book, and now we are getting started with the actual ideas. This part is devoted to the idea of psychological laboratories, the psychological lab. Or we could say it is about experiments and experimentation. As I said in the previous video, I am planning to post a video in this series every Tuesday around 7 p.m. Eastern time. So if you're planning to follow along, read the chapters, which I would encourage you to do, that is our plan. And we are going to discuss the book chapter by chapter. So let's begin with going to the slides. All right, here we are. Great Ideas in Psychology, Part 2, Experiments. This is our author, Fatali M. Moghadam, professor of psychology at Georgetown University and director of the interdisciplinary program in cognitive science. This is something I wasn't sure when I was recording the previous video, but now I double-checked and added that information here. This is our map, the plan of the entire series. It's going to be a long journey because we are on the second step of our series, of our journey. So psychological lab. I'm going to begin this part with a story. This story is called The Man Who Was Recklessly Curious. Some of you might already know the story, might already be familiar. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the story, I think it is worthwhile to talk about experimentation in the human sciences with a story like this, because we can draw a very important point, maybe multiple points from the story. The story is about two friends, very close friends. In fact, these two were such good friends that their friendship was known and famous in the town that they were living in. The names are Lothario and Anselmo, and they were best friends. Lothario gets married to a young lady, a very beautiful young lady named Camilla, while Anselmo remains a bachelor. After a while of going through a honeymoon phase and being very happily married, Lothario starts obsessing over an idea and gets fixated on his wife's loyalty. And he's thinking essentially that, okay, my wife is a faithful wife. She's good to me. She's not cheating on me. But can I be sure that she will never cheat on me? So he keeps thinking, and the more he thinks, the more he is unable to forget this idea, this fixation, this obsession. And he wants to test her. And he keeps wondering with himself, can she pass a difficult test? If she's being seduced by someone, if some other man, a good-looking man, a wealthy man, a very attentive man is pursuing her, can she resist? And they are spending a lot of time with their friend Anselmo. So Lothario tries to convince Anselmo to test his wife by trying to seduce her, by giving her compliments. And he gives Anselmo detailed instructions about what kinds of gifts she likes. And he's even willing to fund and give money for the gifts and give them space. Anselmo, being a good friend, initially refuses and tries to change Lothario's mind. Says, don't do it. What is the outcome of this test? What is the best that can happen? The best that can happen is nothing will happen. So why do anything at all? Why try to test your wife using me? But finally, because of Lothario's persistence, he gives in and agrees, but secretly hoping that, okay, I'll do a little bit, I'll participate a little bit in this scheme, and hoping that things will just pass and he forgets about it. So whenever Anselmo is alone with Camilla, he is just quiet. He doesn't pay any attention to her and doesn't try to seduce her. And after much struggle, despite much struggle, Anselmo falls in love with Camilla, with his best friend's wife, but still tries to behave appropriately and as a good friend. More time passes by, and Camilla also falls in love with Anselmo. And finally, after lots of struggle, after lots of persistence on the part of Lothario, they betray him and they sleep together. So what is the conclusion of this story? Is this an experiment? Did Lothario conduct an experiment? You know, if you look at the story, the beginning of the story, Lothario had a question and he wanted to find an answer to his question. To answer his question, he wanted to test her wife, place her in some situations where her faithfulness presumably is being tested. So is that an experiment? Is that something we can call an experiment? And is that informative? Did Lothario discover something about his wife, or did something else happen? For your information, for those of you who don't know, this story is a very small part in the great novel by Miguel de Cervantes called Don Quixote. This is the title, and the title of the story is translated as the story of a recklessly curious man. Different titles and different translations, but it is a very small part of this this greater novel. For us, the relevant questions are: did Lothario run an experiment? If the answer is no, if you're inclined to say no, he did not do an experiment, then you probably have some idea of what an experiment is. So maybe you can pause this video and give your definition of what an experiment is. What is an experiment that makes you say, no, what Lothario did is not an experiment? What Lothario did was he actually brought about what he was afraid of. He made his worry into a self-fulfilling prophecy, or self-fulfilling worry, a self-fulfilling obsession. He kept pushing and kept pushing his best friend and his wife until they did what he wanted to see if they will do. They did it at the end. Did he have a part in making that happen? Yes, he had agency. His question was framed as discovering something about others, discovering something about his wife. But in fact, it doesn't take much thought, it doesn't take much attention to realize that he didn't discover something external to him, but he participated in what he was trying to find out, and he played a role in making it happen. And the third question I've put here is: what makes an experiment informative? Now, you might think that my example is very far-fetched, that psychologists are not so stupid to deny their own agency in what they are studying. They are really objective, and they try to conduct experiments that are really informative and discovering something about the humans that are being studied. But there's a very comparable case. Actually, there are multiple comparable cases. One of them that comes to mind very easily is a psychological study done by Philip Zimbardo called the Stanford Prison Experiment. And in this experiment, to describe it very briefly, he divided the participants in this study into two groups. He randomly assigned members of the group of participants into either prisoners or guards. And then when you read this book, or when you read or if you read the study, you will notice that he very strongly encouraged them to treat each other in a cruel way, in a cruel and inhuman way. And when they refused, when they tried to get out, one of them actually, he confesses in this book, The Lucifer Effect. He confesses that one of the participants, at least, tried to get out of the experiment and said, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And he pushed him back into the experiment, said, don't quit, go back and continue. And he encouraged the antagonistic, the conflict relationship between the prisoners and the guards. Did he discover something? Or did he create a situation? Did he cause the conflict between the two groups of his participants? So this is a very comparable case to the story with the other story, earlier story of Lothario and Anselmo. The author of our book, Great Ideas in Psychology, uses another example that we can then link to psychological experimentation. This is the story of Hamlet in Shakespeare's Hamlet. which involves also a kind of test. So to test his theory, Hamlet uses a theatrical performance. So he has a theory about what his uncle and what his mother did. And in order to test them, he performs a theatrical drama in front of them and watches their reaction. And based on their very strong emotional reaction, he draws a conclusion about what they did, what they have done. And Muqaddam encourages us to ask, invites us to ask, what are the problems with Hamlet's experiment? Is this experiment valid? And validity in experimentation and in general in psychological studies is a concept that we should learn. What is validity? Validity of a study means whether or not the study is actually doing what it intends to do. So if a study is intending to study the faithfulness or unfaithfulness of participants in a research, if it actually is studying that, then it is valid. If it is studying something else, whether or not participants follow instructions, and that following of instruction actually leads them into unfaithfulness, if it is about that and the researchers don't recognize or don't notice that it is about something else other than what they're intending to study, then we say that the study is not valid. So in the case of Hamlet, Hamlet looks at the emotional reaction of his mother and uncle and concludes they killed my father. But what else could their reaction mean? If that reaction is in fact about the mother and uncle of Hamlet, if they realize that Hamlet suspects them of murder, and it is because of that realization that they are hurt and they get upset. Why is Hamlet suspecting us of murdering his father? If that's why they're showing that emotional reaction, then Hamlet's experiment is not valid. It seems like it is getting a confession out of them, but in that case, in that hypothetical case, the reaction indicates something else. Okay. So with those preliminary examples, now we can get to what an experiment is, what makes something an experiment. It is quite difficult to define what an experiment is. I've tried it in various publications, but we are now following Muqaddam's definition of an experiment. He gives a list of 3 characteristics of what makes something an experiment. And he gives 3 features. The first one is location. An experiment should be separated from other physical space. So physically, it should be separate and isolated. Why? Why should it be separated and isolated? Because you want to control everything that happens in that space, in the space of experimentation. And what do we mean by control? That's the second feature. What we mean by control is you want the participants to have limited options in what they can do in that scenario, in that space. So imagine that I'm doing an experiment in my living room, and my experiment is which one of 2 magazine covers are more attractive and is picked up by research participants more. So there's magazine A and magazine B. But imagine if in that situation, there's also a TV that is on. If there's a window they can look out of, if there are other people in the living room they can talk with. And that gives them, if that's the case, then my research participants who are supposed to give preference either to magazine A or magazine B, they have too many behavioral options. They have too many options to do things. They can watch TV, they can look out the window, and they can talk to other people in the room. That means I don't have enough control over their behavior. So that's not a very robust experiment. To make it more robust, to make it more experimental, to make it more of an experiment, according to this view, I should eliminate other options. I should make the space, you can say, impoverished, make it empty of options. Just a table, coffee table, a couch they can sit on, and 2 magazines equally distanced from where they are sitting down. So that's what we mean by control, limited behavioral options. And ideally, something about the behavior must be measured, the time it takes to pick a magazine. And when you look at 100 people choosing one of 2 magazines, if 70 of them choose magazine A, that's the kind of measurement. The frequency of choosing magazine A over magazine B. The third feature of an experiment is its replicability or reliability. Other people can repeat the same procedures and get the same results. So reliability is a feature of experimental results. Replicability or repeatability is a general feature of experiments. Typical situation, typical design of that follows these, that meets these three requirements is the so-called Skinner box. The location is isolated. It's a cage in which there's a poor animal doing the experiment. There's control. That means the animal has very limited options, cannot move out of the cage, obviously. There's a button or a lever that the animal can press. And reliability means that other people can, repeatability, let's say repeatability. Other people can repeat the experiment and test whether these findings are reliable or not. Now let's get to an example. This is an example of an experimental research published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2014. And in this study, the authors claim that they have found evidence that passionate love makes you less able to control your mental functions. So as the title reads, reduced cognitive control in passionate lovers. What do they do? Well, they recruited participants that had recently fallen in love, according to their own claim. So they advertised the experiment to recruit participants, and they said, if you have fallen in love in the past 6 months and you're willing to come to our experiment, please come in. And so everybody in that experiment had fallen in love within the past 6 months. And then they asked them to rate their passion, romantic interest and feelings on a scale based on a set of questions. So it was a questionnaire. And the first major thing that they did was that they reminded them of their romantic relationships. They asked them to write something about the person that they love, or listen to music that reminds them of their loved one, their beloved boyfriend, girlfriend, or partner. After those reminders, they asked them to perform a task. So this is the experimental task, which involves paying attention to a target and ignoring distractors. So if you are good at performing, if you perform this task well, you ignore the distractors and only pay attention to the target, and your performance shows that you were not distracted. Okay, now there's a key move here. And this move is that this second step, performing a task, is defined as the measure of cognitive control. And because people who self-identified as more in love, they performed poorly, relatively poorly at this task, the authors, the researchers jumped to the conclusion that they cannot control their minds because they are in love. But if you use common sense and just re-describe the task in plain language, what you realize is that this experiment is about something else. It is about reminding people of something else that they care about and then asking them to do something that they don't care about. So if you remind me of something that I care a lot about, and then ask me to pay attention to something that I don't care about, just paying attention to circles and squares and red colors and green colors, I don't care about that. And you just reminded me of something else that I really deeply care about. Why should I pay attention? And why is this a measure of my cognitive control? It is not a measure. Those assumptions are highly questionable. And this is an example of a research that claims itself to be an experiment, but it reveals extremely superficial reasoning. And we should be suspicious of experiments, even experiments that are published in peer-reviewed journals. So compare that with a reality TV show, which I think has so much more dignity as a psychological study. So I'm assuming that a show like Singles Inferno, it is not scripted, that people who are in it are not following a script like actors and actresses, but they're really genuinely participating in the situations designed in that singles inferno, in that isolated island. So you can say that what happens in a show like Singles Inferno or Paradise Hotel or Too Hot to Handle, I haven't watched all of those shows, but I know I have a distant idea of what they are. They are not, properly speaking, they are not experiments. But let's ask, are they informative? When you watch a show like Singles Inferno, do you learn something about the participants in this show? Let me ask that differently. Let me ask instead, do you come to like some of these participants? And do you come to dislike some of these participants? Do you come to that kind of position, that kind of affective response or reaction? It's like, oh yeah, I like this girl or I like this guy. I don't like this guy as much. If you do that, if you do have those responses, those impressions, then it implies that we do learn something about participants in a reality TV show. And that reality TV show is, in that sense, informative. It is informative, even though it is not an experiment. And maybe the way we get to know other people, when we gain knowledge of each other and other people, is maybe not through experimentation and experiments. In this experiment, do we learn something about any of the individuals? No, we don't learn anything. We don't learn anything. In this, by contrast, by observing people going through situations and making decisions, by keeping track of them, we are more likely to learn about them. Just like how Lothario, in the example of the recklessly curious man, he was more likely to learn about his wife by just observing her, being with her, keeping track of her as a fellow human being. Okay, I want to touch on the good examples, maybe the best examples of experimental psychology, experimental research, when the application of experimental method in psychology is genuinely informative. And that tradition, arguably, can be traced back to Gustav Fechner. Gustav Fechner, who we see in this image. Gustav Fechner is the father of psychophysics. And the kinds of experiments that he introduced into physiology and later psychology, the psychophysical experiments, had the following structure. So the logic, pay attention to the logic of this kind of experiments. So imagine that we have these 8 levels of brightness from 0 to 7. I think I'm counting the number right, but I can't be sure. Yes, there are 8 light bulbs there on the screen. And if you count from 0, you get to 7. Now imagine that you pick 2 of these light bulbs, 2 of these levels of brightness. You pick them. You don't tell the participant, the observer, which one you have picked. You just show them 2 random light bulbs and ask them this question. Are these 2 light bulbs the same level of brightness, or are they different? If these 2 light bulbs, if the brightness levels are similar, are not noticeable enough, most people will say they are the same. Or maybe 75% of time, they will say they're the same, they look the same. So Fechner's idea, Fechner's message or conclusion is that physical differences in physical brightness, the physical intensity of the stimulus, does not always lead to perceptual difference or psychological difference. That's why the field is called psychophysics, because it is about the relationship between psychological experience, psychological difference, and the physical stimulation, the physical intensity, physical event, the relationship between psychological events and physical events. And this field of psychophysics was the beginning of cognitive psychology. To follow the example in the second scenario, let's say we pick 2 light bulbs, 2 levels of intensity that are sufficiently different from each other. And then you ask, are these 2 levels of intensity or these 2 levels of brightness, are they different or are they the same? If they are sufficiently different, then people will say, most people will say they are different. And this method of investigation is quite accurate, it's quite reliable, and it gives rise to functions that relate a psychological experience to the physical intensity. So imagine the x-axis here. Imagine the x-axis is the difference between the 2 light bulbs, the difference of brightness between the left and the right light bulbs. If the difference is low, most people will say, no, there's no difference between them. And that's the y-axis. That would be 0 on the y-axis. And the larger the difference between them, you move to the right, in the right direction on the x-axis. And the probability of saying, yes, there is a difference between them on the y-axis, that probability goes up, becomes 1, which is a perfect probability. 100% people will say, yes, there is a difference. And that curve function is a psychophysical function. Okay. Wilhelm Wundt, the person identified as the beginning of psychology as a science, as a separate science. Wilhelm Wundt was impressed by Fechner's studies, and he continued applying the experimental method to other basic functions, simple functions in psychology, including sensation, perceptual judgment, and simple decisions. The decision to hear a tone and then decide if it is a low tone or a high tone using 2 fingers of the right hand. But Wundt believed that the experimental method would be inappropriate for studying more complex psychological processes, which are related to culture. So when Wundt's students at Würzburg School, they started to apply the experimental method to thinking, Wundt did not approve of those studies because he saw their range of applicability for experimentation to be limited to simple, relatively simple psychological functions. If you're interested in what Wundt believed and the debate between Wundt and another philosopher of psychology and philosopher of science, and somebody who had a lot of things to say about consciousness and first person and third person perspectives, I would encourage you to read or check out a book by Chiara Russo-Krauss, Professor Chiara Russo-Krauss, who is a philosopher and historian of science. And in this book, Wundt, Avenarius, and Scientific Psychology, she talks about the debate between Wilhelm Wundt and Richard Avenarius, and how at the present, in our current times, we remember the name Wundt, but the actual ideas that we follow belong to Avenarius, more so than Wundt. So it's quite an interesting read. And this is a comment that I received on the previous video, the first part in this series by Pavio. Pavio had a lot of kind things to say. And one of a part of his comment was about Wundt and the idea that Wundt distanced himself and distanced psychology from philosophy. That is to some extent correct, but we should be more precise if you want to remember Wundt's actual position. There is a paper published in the translation of this paper was published in 2013, translated by James Lamiel, Professor James Lamiel. The original publication of this essay was in 1913, towards the end of Wundt's life. The title of this article is Psychology's Struggle for Existence. This article is written by Wilhelm Wundt, and in it, he argues that if psychology separates itself from philosophy, it cannot survive. Something will survive, a discipline will survive, and they can continue endlessly to produce results and discuss the meaning of those results. But if the relationship between psychology and philosophy is severed, then psychology will not exist as a genuinely informative and enlightening project, because psychology is a branch of philosophy, or at least has to remain in dialogue with philosophy, because its central concerns, central questions of psychology are part of philosophy as well. So the dialogue has to continue. I talked about Gustav Fechner and Wundt, and with Gustav Fechner, I talked about the psychophysical experiments, the early psychophysical experiments that they're still in, people still do experiments of that kind. Psychophysics is still alive as a part of psychology. But another early kind of experiment in psychology is called word association test, that was introduced, I believe, by Francis Galton. So this is another type of experiment that has a relatively long history in psychology. So we can do it now. You can do it as I am presenting a series of words to you. So read every word on this following list and say the first word that comes to your mind. Don't think too much. Just read the word or listen to the word that I say and just say a word in response to that word. Sunlight, camera, research, library, dinner, student. Okay? So in some versions of this word association test, you could present the same list for a first time, and then you can present the second list for, you can present the same list for a second time, not the second list, and get the reactions to the same list again. Now, looking at this structure superficially, just based on what we are looking at now, my question for you is this: what can you measure with this experiment? Yes, you can measure response time. What else can you measure? Can you measure, for example, how common a person's responses are? If you have gathered responses to the same list from 500 people, and you see that in response to sunlight, 400 people, let's say, respond with sun or moon or energy, and there is one person who, in response to sunlight, he says vampire. So can you say that in relation to the sample, in relation to the larger sample, that individual response is atypical? And then you can maybe compare other responses of that individual to different words. Is there a theme that runs through these responses of the individual? So with every kind of performance, the question is, what can we measure about it? And is that informative? In what way can it be informative? You might be surprised to learn that one of the people who used the word association test was the psychoanalyst, the Swiss physician and psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung, who later became an associate of Sigmund Freud. Jung used word association experiments to discover psychological complexes. So a complex is something that is, we can say it is not resolved. It's associated with a lot of strong emotions that are not fully understood to us. So if I have a mother complex, or if I have a death complex, thinking about death, thinking about that thing that I have a complex about, evokes a lot of strong feelings, and I can't really deal with it because I haven't worked through it. It is a complex. So that was Jung's use of the word association test. And to discover complexes, he relied mainly on response times, and he saw delays in response time as a signal of psychological complexes. And Jung became very confident in his use and in the conclusions that he drew from word association tests. And in a lecture, he claims that he did a very simple and very brief version of a word association test with one of his colleagues using only 10 words. And using 10 words, he discovered almost everything that was important about that colleague. So he said, based on the responses to 10 words, he told his colleague that, yes, you studied in France when you were younger, you fell in love, you had a love affair in France, and you still remember that love affair. And recently you have been thinking a lot about death, and you've had some financial issues. And he reports in that lecture that his colleague was very surprised by how much he figured out. So that level of confidence, I think it was a little bit of an exaggeration by Jung. In this chapter, Muqaddam tells us, or reviews some of the general aims of psychological studies. And importantly, he talks about the association between laboratory studies and approaches in psychology. Remember, we talked about approaches in psychological approaches as a background or the frame around ideas in psychology. So experiments were used by behaviorists, and the aim of behaviorism or behaviorist psychology, behavioral psychology, is to find laws that connect stimulus and response. With cognitive psychology, the main approach is still experimentation, but then the interest shifts towards the mediation between stimulus and response, the information processing. Cognitive psychologists want to find how a stimulus turns into a response, and what are the information processing steps between those two, beginning and last stages. Cognitive neuroscience modifies that aim and adds an interest in brain structures and functions, in addition to the kind of information processing that happens in the mind. We read on page 16 that the laboratory method, as traditionally used in psychology, has been associated with reductionism. And what is reductionism? The attempt to explain behavior with reference to smaller units. So this is a reductionism in behavior. In general, reductionism means that you can, or is a promise that you can understand complex phenomena, complex things, if we understand the basic elements, the basic building blocks of the complex phenomena. That you don't really need something extra to understand the complex phenomena. If you really properly understand the basic building blocks, the basic elements, then that's enough. And the complex phenomena will be understood. So that is reductionism. What is the opposite of reductionism? You can say emergentism or holism. But moving on, an important example in recent history of social psychology and the application of experiments is the studies by Henri Tajfel, which were about in-group, out-group distinction. Tajfel calls this paradigm the minimal group paradigm. If somebody participates in these experimental paradigms, they are told that there are two groups, maybe the blue team and the red team, and you belong to the red team. So each person is assigned to a team, and then the experimenter will use some method to see whether there is a bias, whether the person has a bias in favor of their own group and against the other group, even though they don't know anything about what the groups are, what the groups are doing, is there a conflict between them. It's just the minimal information, the minimal set of information about there are different groups and you are assigned to one of them. And when participants are asked to give an advantage or a favor to one of the groups, they prefer to give an advantage to their own team. So the minimal group paradigm is replicable, it's reliable, and it has been replicated many times. What is debatable about it, what people continue to debate, is its meaning and importance. What does it mean that people have some bias in favor of their minimal group? Does it mean that we cannot shake off our in-group bias and bias against out-group members? How important is this kind of experiment? Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about the critique of experimental psychology. But let's begin with some general notes about critique. These are some of my beliefs, and I think they are defensible beliefs. A critique of something does not mean dismissing something. If you criticize your friend, it doesn't mean that you want to stop being with that friend. The next point is the critique of something does not mean we must stop doing it. If you critique a film, you don't mean that the director has to stop making films. If you critique an experiment, you don't mean people should stop doing that kind of experiments. If you criticize experimental psychology, you don't mean that people should stop doing experimental psychology. The next point is that critique of something means we must be more aware of what that thing is, where it comes from, its history, its roots, and its consequences, how it is related to other things, systems of power, for example, political situation, the culture, the surrounding culture. When you critique something, this is the essential aim of critique. What you want to do is you want to save the best parts of it and remove the bad parts, remove the parts that are hindering those good parts. Okay, so with those notes in mind, let's go through a number of general critiques that you can think about if you read psychological literature, experimental literature. The first one is experimental method gives the appearance of science without necessarily having scientific rigor. This is the example. We can use Carl Jung's example here. He was using something, and a kind of experiment, word association test, and he was overly confident. And what he was doing really looked experimental. It looked like something people do in other sciences like physics. But the appearance of science doesn't mean actual science. And the extreme example of this problem is in cases of fraud, when people fake science, fake data. So this is an extreme example we can read about in the autobiography of Diederik Staple. It's a memoir, not a full autobiography. In Dutch, it is called aansporing. Aansporing literally means derailment or getting off the rail. Aansporing, but in English, the English version is translated by Nicholas Brown, and it is titled "Faking Science: A True Story of Academic Fraud," and it is available for free online. It's a very interesting story, very alarming, but also enlightening. How somebody can use the appearances and manipulate the impression of their career, a field of research, and how when that is taken away, when people find that the person was manipulating and faking data, too much trust is damaged in the entire field. So experimentation, because it is borrowed from the harder sciences like physiology and physics, because the method is taken from those other fields, other sciences, and applied sometimes mindlessly in psychology, it does have the appearance of science, but it's not always appropriate. It's not always the appropriate method in psychology. Okay, the second point, the ability to participate in an experiment is a complex social contract. So being able to be a participant, to go into a lab and say, I'm willing to participate in this experiment. This is not representative of all human beings. Not everybody has that cultural capacity. For that reason, experimental psychology, experimental method is a method that can only stay within a special bubble, within a particular bubble that is culturally enabled. This is a passage relevant from the book, page 21. We read, quote, "Imagine going to a village in a non-Western country, as I have done, and asking villagers who may be illiterate, economically poor, and technologically unsophisticated to participate in a laboratory experiment. Typical responses from villagers are very likely to be, who are you, a government agent? What is a laboratory? From what you describe, it seems like a kind of prison. What law have I broken that you want to put me in a room by myself? Even if you offer to pay such villagers, they will be very suspicious about your intentions and will be bewildered as to what you want from them." End quote. And I have heard almost exactly the same thing from my colleagues who have gone to rural areas in China to collect data from people in villages there. People are very suspicious, and this suspicion of the researcher being a government agent, that has also been replicated in my experience. Third point, the third point part one, 3A. So experimental psychology places too much emphasis on isolated individuals. In other words, it has a bias that if you understand the isolated individuals detached from social contexts, from the community, that is all you need to understand. So this approach puts too much emphasis on individuality in explaining behavior. And the method itself, by isolating the person, the method itself disconnects the individual from the social environment. So this bias is related to the general bias of individualism. In the book, we read that an example of this, or a consequence of this individualistic bias. Quote, "If Jane is a millionaire and Carol is penniless, It must be because Jane is hardworking, talented, motivated, and so on, and Carol is not, end quote. So these are all attributes that are about the individual. Almost you can say they're inside the individual brain. And there's no attention being paid to larger structures in society, in community, in culture. 3B, even in studying perception, memory, decision-making, it is not the isolated mind that remembers or perceives, but a mind that is connected to an environment. Remember, if you have watched another series of videos, or if you have read the book, The Knowledge Illusion, there is a study reviewed in that book about couples. When you share some information with a couple, if one of the couples has an expertise related to that information, without talking to each other, that person remembers because the couple is together receiving the information, and the person who doesn't have expertise and knows that the other person in the couple has expertise kind of lets go of the information, thinking that, okay, my partner is going to remember this piece of information because they know more about it. And the other person coordinates as well. So we remember, perceive, make decisions together when you actually look at us in social contexts, when we are working and interacting with other people. So here in the book we read, we need to constantly move back and forth from laboratory research, the place where people are isolated, to explorations in the world outside, where people are not necessarily isolated from each other. Point 4 in critique of experimental psychology. The type of simple causality assumed in experimental method is too simplistic. So the type of causality that people usually describe in terms of billiard balls. Ball A hits ball B and ball B starts moving. So A causes B. That's the simplistic causal connections that experimental psychology also wants to understand based on very simple Newtonian metaphors, Newtonian physics. Think about watching a movie. 3 people watch a movie, the same movie. Person A will get bored. Person B will cry, get emotional. Person C will get deep in thought. Did the movie cause these reactions? Can you say the movie caused the person to cry? The movie caused the person to get bored? I don't think that would be fair or accurate. It would be more accurate to say the movie catalyzed persons A, B, C, and their existing inclinations, traits, moods. The person C maybe already had the inclination to get deep in thought, and the movie brought about, or they activated that inclination. So catalyzing, catalysis, being catalyzed, that is a more psychologically appropriate language because it recognizes that things are already going on in the human mind and in human behavior. And we should take into account the existing states in a person's behavior and inclinations and mental state, mental life. There are things already going on, and that simplistic A causes B doesn't apply. The author, Fatali Muqaddam, has a book co-written by Rom Hare, co-edited, I believe. And the title of that book is Questioning Causality. And if you're interested in this topic, you should check out that book. Number 5, what people do in any given situation, including the situation of an experiment, depends on what is available to them. Remember that scenario of my hypothetical experiment with 2 magazine covers, which one is more attractive? In that experiment, I made sure that the magazine covers or the magazines are the only available options for my imagined research participants. What is important for us is to note that culture, what culture a person belongs to. Culture makes some behaviors available in some situations. Culture also encourages or discourages some behaviors in some situations. And following that, a culture is not uniform. Just knowing that somebody is from Japan or from India or from Canada. Just knowing that somebody's from a given culture doesn't give us sufficient information. A culture has different parts, different positions, different subcultures. A poor side, for example, again, this is a simplistic description, but you can at least divide culture into a poor side and a rich side of the culture financially. A rich person will seek medical care very soon after a mild symptom, whereas a poor person will not seek medical care even if they have serious conditions, serious illnesses. This is why they say, I heard this statement, unforgettable statement, that poor people die quietly because the culture that they inhabit, remember the previous point, the culture that they inhabit doesn't encourage checking up with a doctor if you're feeling sick. They feel like that is not available to them. Again, another quote from the book: most so-called cross-cultural research continues to rely on university students recruited in Western and non-Western societies. The outcome is that behavior in the laboratory is often reported to be cross-culturally consistent, when in fact the participants are all from the same university students' culture, even when they live in non-Western societies. End quote. So basically, when you compare student participants in China and student participants in the US, you are not sampling the difference between the two cultures because you're sampling samples. You're taking samples from university life, the university students, and there's a lot that is in common in the culture or subculture of university students, university student life. So that does not justify the claim that, oh, there was no difference between the two samples, one from China and one from the US. Because those parts of the two cultures that you took from, they are too similar. 7, experimenters usually ignore external validity. They don't usually care about if something similar happens in the outside world, outside of the lab, outside of the isolated situation of the laboratory. Will it happen in the same way? That is called external validity. Reliability in relation to the outside world or different situations. And last, number 8, experimenters ignore the looping effect. This is introduced or brought to our attention by Ian Hacking, the looping effect. Looping effect says that findings of psychological studies can change the behavior of people who learn about them. So when you learn about obedience to authority, I say, oh, people follow authority, follow the orders of authority, even when those orders are unethical. If you believe in that, does that change your behavior? If you really believe in that, is that a kind of brainwashing? Similarly, believing in the Lucifer effect, the despicable study by Philip Zimbardo, believing in the Lucifer effect, does that make you more cruel when you get the opportunity to be cruel? Believing that humans are irrational, does that make you less careful in your thinking? If I really believe that all humans are irrational, we don't have as much capacity as we think to think rationally. If I really believe in that, do I then give myself the license to be even less responsible in my thinking? So the looping effect is something that psychologists should be mindful of. The advocacy, the fact that we advocate for the true statements of a kind of psychological result or finding or a psychological phenomenon, that might have an impact in the larger society if people hear about them. So in summary, experimental psychology is successful in giving the appearance of scientific rigor and in producing results that are repeatable and reliable. However, there are debates and disagreements about the validity, the meaning, interpretation of experimental results, their relevance to real human life, and what they miss based on their assumptions about individualism, the assumption of the isolated mind, and causality. They don't really pay attention to the existing states in people's minds. They run the same experiments with 100 people and use with averages. And when you talk about the average person, you can't say A caused B. Making people depressed did make them more creative or less creative. If you look at the averages, you can more easily deal with the average and make statements, questionable statements about averages. But when you pay attention to individuals, particular individuals, then those assumptions of individualism and simplistic causal statements become more easily open to questioning and revision. I think this is a good place to stop. Thank you for your attention. If you would like to support this series and in general my YouTube project, please visit Patreon. This is the best way to support me. I currently don't have institutional support, so it will make a big difference if you decide to support what I do, including this series on the great ideas. I also write occasionally on my website or blog, dgozli.com. And another way you can support my videos, my channel, is by liking this video and by commenting and subscribing. That gives me an advantage with the YouTube algorithm and gives my channel hopefully more visibility. All right. Thanks again. And we will continue the series next time.